Hello everybody and welcome back inside the box for another episode of Gunpla Kitbash with me, Kukamatsu. In this episode we're going to do a little bit of weathering, and it is in fact the last thing we have to do on the project. So, let's jump right in. Okay, and it is time for the final step of this build, which is going to be doing some weathering. The one thing that I did since the last video was just give everything a coat of this, which is Tamiya XF86 flat clear. The reason I did that was, the primary reason was to seal in the decals that we did before, and then also I like just a slightly flatter quality to the panels specifically. So what I did was I sprayed it, concentrating it more on the panels and not so much on the metal parts, so I still have a little bit of shininess on the metal and then a flatter result on the panels. I'm a big fan of some of the amazing weathering work that you see people doing online, both in the the Gunpla world, plus the tank building community, airplanes and all that kind of stuff. I watch a lot of that stuff online, and it's amazing what people do in terms of weathering. I one day would like to be that guy who is willing to spend 40 hours painting every individual paint chip on a panel or something like that. But I love the result of that. But I'm not actually that guy at this stage in my life. I don't have that kind of time, and I think the focus for me really is the build, and the weathering part is sort of, I want to get a good result, but I don't want to spend a ton of time on it. So the technique today is kind of a quick and dirty way to get what I think is a pretty good result. It's basically going to be a two-stage process. The first one is going to be a gunk wash that sort of just takes all of the newness out of the look of the panels. And then there will be a chipping pass. So let's deal with the gunk wash first. I'm going to try using these two as my colors for that, which is Field Blue XF50 and Native Black XF69. I want to go for a kind of not an organic kind of color, so I often use one that's sort of greenish, and it gives sort of a nice sort of natural wear and tear look to it. But since this guy is, at least in my mind, operating primarily in space, I'm going to go for a less organic one, just sort of a cooler color one, because I think that's going to work better with this particular paint job. So instead of actually mixing these together and creating a color, I'm going to pour some in different pots here, and that way I can do kind of a mix as I go strategy, so that I'm not getting just one solid color, but kind of a little bit of variation with the two of them. So I'm just using tap water because I don't want to damage the paint. Even though I have the clear on there, it's not super protective. It's not like a lacquer top coat that it would totally protect it from just about anything. It's still just the Tamiya acrylic top coat, so it is definitely a little bit more vulnerable to things like isopropyl alcohol or any kind of other thinners. So that's why I'm just going to use tap water. So I've got the two colors of paint ready to go, and then I've got two of the things of water. One is going to be to thin down the paints, and the other one is going to be to do a preload of water on the surface so that the paint flows around it better. So I want to basically keep that one somewhat clean. I also have a bunch of Q-tips ready, and these makeup sponges, and then I have a couple of brushes here. The basic idea is that take some of the clean water and preload it. I'm doing this on the back of the leg. It's always good to do a little bit of testing first. So I'm just going to kind of mix this in the middle. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flood the whole surface with a bit of paint, and then wipe that down with a sponge. And that's just going to give it a little bit of grunginess, not too much. I don't want to go overboard. I don't want to make this guy look like he's just been through a mess. It's just sort of wear and tear that is then, when it's in maintenance, it gets cleaned up. But it just gives it a little bit of look like it's not brand new. I think that's looking pretty good. It's very subtle, but I think that's a good thing. You have to work fairly quickly, just because it will start to dry on there. And you can kind of see the difference. It just gives a little bit of darkness. I don't want it to be too extreme, because I do like the color scheme. I'm going to put a little bit of extra into these details just to bring it out a little bit. There you go. And people ask me why I don't do panel lining, the kind of traditional panel lining where you're filling in each line with a dark color. And the reason for that is just simply because it's, that's more of a graphic style. It's not quite as realistic. I like the graphic style when you're doing when that's your intention. But for me, I'm trying to go for a slightly more realistic look, so that's why I'm doing it like this. And even though it won't show up too much on the darker areas, I am still going over absolutely everything, just because it does create a subtle effect. But the main goal really is just to knock the white out of the white. I'm pretty happy with how this is going. I'm liking the results. I'm getting a bit more confident in doing bigger areas. Because I like how it's looking. The sponge will start to get saturated with water, so then that's why I have a bunch of them, so you can easily switch to a fresh one. Since you have to work quickly, you do kind of have to be prepared for that. So you don't want to get sponge strokes on there. You want to be able to get it off and looking natural. The preload of the water just helps the paint flow a little bit better, because it's the Tamiya acrylics. It's not really going to flow around as well if it's going onto a dry surface, but if it has that water to flow into, it will flow better. And I find if you don't put the water down, it's more likely to leave a darker thing that you can't wipe off as easily. Here we go, that's the Grunge Wash, and I'm just going to compare it to the untouched one. Like I say, it's pretty subtle, but I think it creates a nice effect. Okay, there we go. I've done a once-over on all of the parts, and I'm pretty happy with the result. I know a lot of people out there really like the clean build style, and would never have done this or wanted me to do this step to this. And I totally understand that. I like the clean builds as well, and I always have a debate with myself every time I sort of get to this stage and I see it all like clean and perfect and beautifully painted, and I'm always so reluctant to kind of mess that up. But then I do this and I get to this stage and I'm always much happier with the result, because it brings out the details and it gives it that sort of lived in look, and just takes a step towards the realism side of things, which I really like. So really it just comes down to a personal choice, whether you want to weather, and whether it's just, a little bit of panel lining to bring out the details, or sort of this more all over effect of grunge pass, and then we're going to do chipping still. Or if it's the 40, 50 hours of doing all of the detail and all of the layers of weathering that some people do. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, I really recommend a YouTuber called Night Shift Modeler. I'm a big fan of his channel, and he does tanks primarily, and but just the level of detail that he goes to with the weathering is out of this world. Very inspiring stuff. And maybe one day when I retired, have lots of free time, I will get to that stage. But for now, this is sort of where I am. So all that being said, I could actually stop at this stage and be quite happy. But I do really like a little bit of chipping effects on here too, so we're going to do one more step. I'm just going to clean up this mess a little bit and set up for that. Okay, well, I basically am going to have two things going on here. I find the chipping effect that I do works really nicely on the lighter colors, but on the darker colors it doesn't turn out so well. The main reason is just because that when you're revealing kind of the metal color beneath the paint, it's pretty close to the same color as the darker paint, and so it doesn't really show up as well. You can sort of switch to a more rusty colored metal, but I don't really want to have a rusty color in this, so for the dark I'm just going to do some dry brushing, and then for the light I'm going to do the more detailed chipping effects. For the dark stuff I'm basically trying to just bring out some of the details and give it a little bit of wear and tear on the edges. So for the darker stuff I basically want to use a color that's just a little bit lighter than the original color. I could just take the original German gray and add a little bit of white to it to make it lighter, but I do have other gray options available. So I'm going to try this, which is the XF24 dark gray. So I'm going to do something similar that I did with the metal painting, which is just to totally saturate the brush with paint to start, but then try and wipe as much of it off as I can on the paper towel. We'll see if this color is light enough. It's actually showing up quite dark on the paper towel compared to what it looks like in the pot, so it might be too dark. Let's just see. I can see it, but it's super subtle, so I'm actually going to switch to a lighter gray, see what I can find. Okay, I'm going to give this a go. This is neutral gray XF53. See what that looks like. Oh, it's empty. I think what I'm going to try is this, which is light gray, and it seems to have a slight blue tinge to it, so it might work very well. Lightly drag it over and see how it looks. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty cool. It's bringing out the detail, giving it that worn edge look without being too excessive. It's really important to have almost no paint on the brush for this to work. Otherwise you start getting really obvious brush strokes across the surface, which you probably want to avoid. I think that's looking pretty cool. It's a very subtle effect, but it definitely brings out the details in a nice way. I'll do that on all the rest of the dark color. Okay, I'm pretty happy with the result on the darker areas, but I have to say this light gray, for some reason it was very thin. I don't know if that's just the color or this pot just happens to be a thinner consistency. It did make it more difficult to do the dry brushing, so I think thicker is probably better. I'll show you just how thin it is. You can see it's really liquidy. So yeah, it made it more difficult. I did get a result that I'm happy with, but just something to be aware of. For the dry brushing on the lighter blue, I'm going to try this, which is Ocean Gray 2 XF82. Just going to try it on the back of the foot first to see if I like what it looks like. I don't really. I'd like it to be more bluish, so I'll try something else. It has blue on the lid, but it comes out actually quite gray, so I'm going to try something with more blue in it. Okay, well I didn't really find anything that I found appropriate, so I'm going to have to mix something. I'm going to take the base blue, which was this medium blue XF18, and I'll just put a little bit of the flat white XF2 in it, just to lighten up it a little bit, not too much. I think that is much more in the neighborhood of what I was looking for, so we'll try that. Hopefully it's light enough. I'll just make sure there's enough paint on the brush here. Yeah, I think that's working a lot better. It just kind of gives that look like the paint's been scraped, but not all the way through to the metal. So it kind of reveals a slightly lighter version underneath, which I think works really well on these darker colors. Okay, the dark colors are all looking really good now, I think. And now it's time for the white, and this is going to be totally different. This is, instead of doing any dry brushing at all, I think I'm just going to go in with the paintbrush, and where you would get some chipping on the corner, I'm just going to give it a little bit of paint like that. Now, scale wise, this is probably not at all realistic, because these chips would be, in real life, would be huge. But this is kind of a choice you have to make when you're model making. You can keep everything in total scale, or you can do something that is a little bit easier to see, I guess, and easier to achieve. It's kind of a personal choice in that way. A lot of times with models, the details are slightly enlarged, and that just creates a nice effect that you can see easily. So basically, I'm just imagining these chipped areas here, kind of the areas where it would be likely to rub up against something or get dinged or whatever. Oh dear. I've just messed that up entirely. I put it down on a wet bit of paint, and I've totally messed this up. Yeah, I've messed that up pretty bad. I did sort of run and get a little bit of water on a sponge to see if I could wipe it off, but it's too late. It is definitely on there. So don't know exactly what I'm going to do about that. In the meantime, I'm going to just make sure I wash my brush so I don't wreck that, and then I'm going to figure out what I'm going to do with this mistake that I've made here. Okay, well, I've managed to get those two parts off. I think what I'm actually going to do, and I can't think of any other solution, is I'm going to give it a little sand to make sure there's no texture on there. It's pretty smooth, but I just want to make sure that it's kind of fine. And I'm going to actually go through the process of airbrushing it again and re-weathering it just to get it back to what it should be. It's just too big of an area to sort of play off as battle damage or whatever. I'm not doing battle damage, I'm just doing a bit of chipping, so it's just too much. So I'm gonna just give it a quick once over with the airbrush again. Kind of sets me back a little bit in terms of time for the day, but I think I just can't leave it like that. Okay, well, that was an unintended detour. I actually ended up repainting these both, the base colors, and then did a flat coat of the clear, and then did the weathering again. So there we go, back to where I was a while ago. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I just had to pull out the airbrush and do that quickly, but it wasn't too bad. So back to what we were doing before. So just going back to putting areas of white where there might be some chipping. And this looks a little bit weird to begin with, but once we get into the next step, it'll make sense. I have discovered the hard way that if you do too much of this, then it just looks spotty at the end. So I try to be a little bit conservative. And then once that white paint is dry, I go back in with the Gunmetal X10, and I'm just going to paint on the same areas, but try and leave a little bit of white showing so that it looks like you can see the thickness of the paint there. It kind of gives it this almost three-dimensional quality, even though you're adding it on top of the paint. It makes it look like the gunmetal is lower because you can sort of see an edge of the paint there. It's quite a nice effect and fairly easy to achieve. It's a little bit finicky to paint, but totally worth it. The gunmetal paint over time will get thicker, I find, and it's easier to do when it's thinner, a little bit thinner, so you can always thin it down with a bit of water if it's not flowing very well. The main trick here is just finding the parts where you did paint them white to begin with. Sometimes it's hard to find. And you can do this detail quite small if you want to. It still works pretty well. I found even while I was doing the white, I'm already thinking, okay, how can I do this faster? So I I don't want to do every single little spot really particularly. Some people love that kind of stuff and could do it forever. I have patience for some stuff, but some stuff I don't. So I tend to spend the time on the stuff I do have patience on and find quicker ways to do the things I don't have patience for. The white line needs to be thin enough that it's convincing as an edge, but thick enough that it can be seen. And be sure to keep sort of stirring the gunmetal. This takes long enough that it will start to settle, and actually the dark stuff ends up on the top, and your result can be much darker than you intended it to be. There we go. I'm happy with that. It's looking subtle but cool. It's one of those little details that just adds to the overall effect but doesn't jump out at you, hopefully. There is one last thing that I want to do, and that is just bring it back a little bit of the highlight edge of the metal. It's been sort of beaten up by this weathering a little bit, so I figure fresh scratches would scratch through everything, including the dirt layer. So I'm going to do a little bit of extra dry brushing on top of that. Just a tiny little bit to bring back the shiny pings on the edges of stuff. Just kind of brings it back to life in a nice way. Really brought the detail back out in that area. Really love that, how that turned out. Really nice. So my friends, that is the last bit of the build. All there is to do is put this together and film it and show it to you. So that'll be happening next week. I hope you tune in for that. I really appreciate you sticking around for this whole journey. I'm really excited to show you the final result. Thank you very much for watching. That is the end of this week's episode. And it is the end of the build. Next week will be the final reveal. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you give me a like on your way out, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.